It's really nice to be here. Thank you, everybody, for your interest. And I think with Maria, with the introduction she gave, she's almost covered everything that I'm going to say. So I'd like to start off with my disclosures, which are pretty minimal. I'm active in a patient group that does receive unrestricted grants from pharma companies, but that's my major restriction. And so I'm starting here with my favorite slide, which is the burden, right? It's so much work having a chronic disease. And this is to tell you a little bit about the event that made me feel that improvement was necessary in healthcare. I'm one of those people who kept going to the doctor saying, I've got a problem. And he said, hey, you're a busy, active mom. You know, this is normal. It's like for 2 years, it was all in my head until I managed to get myself to a foot clinic where an orthopedic surgeon said, send the lady for a blood test. And he figured out within a minute I had rheumatoid arthritis. So knowing the diagnosis was a big relief. But on the other hand, I became depressed, anxious. I had to change my job because my original job took too much physical energy, too much jumping up and down. And so my family life suffered, my social life suffered, but at least I was able to keep on working, which is kind of a sad commentary on my priorities. And so I had an online support group from the beginning that helped me to fill the gaps. And while we were really enthusiastic about encouraging one another, we also exchanged links to research studies so that we were sharing reliable information instead of all these cleanses and so on. And so this habit of reading research abstracts and papers made me more comfortable with a challenging vocabulary. And then I hit retirement. So all of a sudden, I had 60 hours a week free to do whatever I wanted. And they say, learn a language when you retire, right? Keep your brain active. So French, Spanish, but I'm a fairly practical person, and you have to spend money to go where you can speak those languages. Whereas I already had to learn medical just to keep me going. So I figured I'll learn medical and be healthy for life. And as I became inspired by the patient movement that I saw online, 3 important events occurred. So I plan to tell you about my events, and then the story of me and the strategy for patient-oriented research, and then some thoughts and ideas about recruiting, encouraging, and welcoming patients and caregivers as research partners. And so every time I say patients, if I don't add caregivers, I mean to, but it's a mouthful. Then, this doesn't show up perfectly, but I decided when I had these hours to fill that I would share information about self-management of chronic disease and team-based care by blogging. But it's really unsatisfying to do this when your only audience is your husband. And he's not that anxious to read it the minute you're done. So I joined social media, specifically Twitter, and I began tweeting links to research papers about rheumatoid arthritis. Because you have to offer some value on Twitter. You can't just tweet pictures about your lunch and say, read my blog. And so what I like about this slide is the community and the connectedness it represents. One of those red dots on the slide is based on my tweets during the Medicine X live stream in 2013. And so my goal for 2014 was to go to Medicine X at Stanford in real life. So I applied and I received a partial scholarship. So you don't get to be a patient partner for nothing. So every patient scholar had a task, and my job was to be on the design thinking challenge, the user-centered design experience. And so the patients on this track were put on a team with a range of healthcare professionals. We had doctors, surgeons, researchers, even venture capitalists on our teams. And I was coached over the summer on design thinking and sent a book. They said, watch videos. And my 10 problems got narrowed down to 3. So when I presented the 3 to the team, they picked one. And we created 4 prototype solutions over the day. And I thought my team was amazing. Our tools to improve communications between doctor and patient were simple and useful. But in thinking about the team, as I prepared to go on to the main stage to report the results, I realized that the solutions produced by all of the groups were strong thanks to the whole team, including the patient. And so that conviction that patients need to be on the team, there's the medium, there's the next slide. That conviction that patients need to be on the team has been a bedrock belief that has kept me motivated even when I've frequently experienced rejection. And so as I carried on tweeting about rheumatoid arthritis, a researcher in BC noticed and connected with me. So on this slide, you see a copy of a graphic like we're going to have today, drawn for the in-person event created by patients and researchers working together for the annual Reaching Out with Arthritis research event, which I now know was a knowledge translation event. So the patients and researchers together put this event together, and the researcher asked me to help out with the project by doing a tweet chat alongside the in-person and the online presentation. It was a challenge to do a 3-hour tweet chat, but I didn't even realize until we were done and they were starting to get to work on the serious project that it was a formal research project. So it was pretty painless being a partner. This happened in 2014, but it wasn't until 2017 that it got published. So 2014 was a pivotal year. At a conference right after Medicine X, I heard Nancy Marlett speak about PACER, the Patient and Community Engagement Research course that's offered at the University of Calgary. I thought it would be impossible to get involved because it takes place in Alberta, and I live in Toronto. But a few months later, I saw a tweet from somebody in Toronto who wanted to form a team. I already had Nancy's book, Gray Matters, so I joined. And that's a picture of the team, the 3 of us, with the poster we presented at the BC Patient Safety and Quality Conference. So these are the 3 events that made me feel like a real e-patient, equipped, enabled, and engaged. And I guess my 3 lessons were that the patients needed on the team, that research can be painless and fun, and thirdly, it's a lot of work, but I can do it. And then we get to the strategy for patient-oriented research. I thought that it was a great idea. I was really excited by the concept of seeing patients as proactive partners who need to be involved in research to help shape it and ensure questions and results are relevant. We heard a lot about the history of SPORE yesterday, but as it became a reality with the funding partnerships between CIHR and the provinces, territories, philanthropies, academic institutions, and health charities, I saw it creating numerous opportunities for patients, caregivers, and the public to get involved in research at various levels, depending on their interest and availability. And we've seen other partner organizations follow in the lead of SPORE and the support units in mandating patient engagement in research. But mandated or not, how do patients find their way to patient-oriented research? In 2014, I was trying to find a way to get involved with the strategy for patient-oriented research, so I was emailing them. And after months of trying, somebody said, well, we'll interview you. So they talked to me, they sent me reading material on the formative event that they had, and a link to a webinar that was pointedly about making decisions when resources are scarce. But that was the end of the line. So I took one of the statements that I'd heard from SPORE and went on to the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, because as I understand it, they fielded the first 17 patient-oriented research projects. And they basically said, well, maybe one of these 17 projects will reach out to you. That was never going to happen. And then they said that actually they encouraged other organizations to engage with patients, but that wasn't their mandate, which was discouraging. And as an aside, they've changed. They now have a patient on their board working in their patient engagement area, and they do engage through the year. Anyway, I found another hint there. They suggested I should join Patients Canada, so with great skepticism, I did that. And I ended up getting involved looking at key performance indicators, where you're analyzing a patient's story and trying to see what one thing that could change to make this story have a better outcome. And another patient I met there, and this must have been the sign, this must have been the clue, was designated as team lead for an Ontario Spore Support Unit project that was led by and made up of patients. So there I was on another team. And we produced tools on this team. One tool was to help researchers learn more about collaborating with patient and caregiver partners. And another one was to help patients and caregivers learn some basics about working on research projects as team members. On this, we also produced surveys so that it could be evaluated. And when our tools were rated by the CEPPP, which is the Center of Excellence on Partnerships with Patients and the Public in Quebec, who was commissioned by SPORE to do this evaluation, we ranked in second place. And ironically, we were limited by the score we got for patient engagement. So our tools and our surveys are now on the Ontario Spore Support Unit website. There's a link on the slide. And so did this mean I'd found my way into a strategic level of patient-oriented research? No, it didn't. The clues led to a meaningful project, but it was patients who led me to the next step, which isn't technically research, but through conversations. As we worked on the SPORE demonstration project, we became even more sensitized to the difficulties we had as patients and caregivers in getting connected with one another and in learning to be effective. And all four of us on that team went on to be co-founders of the Patient Advisors Network, which is a national community of practice among patients and caregivers for 2 years now. And that helps us to gain a personal and supportive introduction to collaboration. And by connecting with one another, we can get assistance with skills and advice from our less and more experienced peers. And it also gives us an information exchange and continued support for the increasingly specialized partnerships that are expected by healthcare and research partners. You don't see much of us, but on our homepage we do have storytelling tips. One set of tips for people who are asking us to tell stories, and another set of tips for the people who are being asked, for the people telling their stories. So Carolyn Canfield wrote a paper in Longwoods in this past December, and the two quotes on this slide address the lack of diversity among patient advisors and the lack of structural support for capacity development. She goes on to mention the invisible barriers of power, availability, stamina, voice, setting, appearance, and finances as dimensions of a passive but brutally effective recruitment screen that gives the greatest access and capacity to pursue engagement opportunities to people with a less immediate need for care. Carolyn's so hard-hitting. She also says that as patients and caregivers, none of us are representative, since all of our healthcare experiences are specific and unique. And yet, even as privileged patient advisors who are at the table, we are often not heard or we're taken for granted. Another Carolyn quote, "More help is needed to support patients to fulfill the potential for fully diverse, competent, and fulfilling collaboration." And in the article, she doesn't even mention obstacles like jargon, project management, token integration of lived experience, and the lack of confidence patients and caregivers can have in shaping a contribution in a research context. So recognizing the knowledge imbalance, we've seen more courses become available for both researchers and patients and caregivers. Even though an evidence base to advance patient engagement is largely absent. That's a quote from a recent co-design scoping review by Tamara McKinnon and others, including Sandra Zielinski, who's another PACER graduate in the audience and who you might have seen yesterday. So these courses are hard. They're available, but they're hard for the average person to find. Even people who are active in the area don't find them readily. And there's no cohesive way for patients to come forward and get involved in the courses or in the research. And how can patients be meaningfully engaged without information and background? And how can researchers learn good patient-oriented research skills? I was thinking maybe we need a patient engagement module that's somewhat like the TCPS2 ethics module that CIHR offers to everybody who's involved in research. This is my badge from the SPORE Summit, but I altered it. It's actually not easy to join this group of people who are sometimes, often called the usual suspects. And I've spent thousands of hours reading and learning what I need to know to be a productive, useful participant. And so I've appreciated all the help I've gotten along the way in the form of tips and partly open doors and these hints that I was luckily able to pick up. And so to encourage diversity, I'd suggest that researchers, organizations, and funders look for creative ideas as to where, when, and how to engage with the people who aren't heard. You can't look at people like me and ask us to provide diversity, because unfortunately my acquaintances are not usually ranging across the whole spectrum of the Canadian population. So I met a young Indigenous man who originally got involved for the per diem, which is a vote for compensation there. And he's now an enthusiastic champion for patients in research. Another person I met at the SPORE Summit was an Inuit woman, but she didn't qualify to be a member of the research team she was interested in because she'd moved to a large city for better access to medical care. So, I mean, a good story and a disappointing story. I put some recruiting ideas on that slide. I spent 20 years as a recruiter in a market research company. And another tip is people who work for disease organizations and patient groups, they often can't give you any people to help you with your research because of privacy issues, but even if they can't contact their members, they themselves might be possibilities, or they might be able to refer friends. And ideally, you reach these groups with enough lead time that they might be able to put that in their newsletter. Or, of course, in BC, you've got the Patient Voices Network that's very helpful. And I was happy to learn more yesterday from Chiara about the Alberta Support Unit Patient and Family Registry that helps patients and researchers connect. And I'm sure everybody's heard this many times, but it's best practice to have more than one patient and caregiver on a project. I mean, after all, we've all got health problems one way or another. And ideally, one with experience and one without. The experienced person can be like the trailbreaker, the mentor, or the cover. I've often sat in conversations on webinars and let somebody I thought was either more bold or more experienced make the first comment. Because when you sit down at a team meeting with experts, it's really hard not to be intimidated by all the academic degrees in the room. And when your own knowledge is experiential, you're often used to people discounting what you have to say. And so in my opinion, The most important way to include patients is to welcome them and to encourage them. And I made another list of barriers and potential solutions. On my first research project, I had expertise that the other team members lacked, and I thought I was helping out rather than doing research, so I didn't see the barriers. The second project, though, was a classic, so everything on this slide happened, as well as having them change the location while I was en route. So I had to search for them through the building. The team asked questions to try to include me, but I only had one page of background, and it was about pharmacogenomics, so I really wasn't willing to say too much. The ethical issue that I raised about them wanting biologic samples didn't seem to worry them. And in that case especially, the bios with thumbnail photos would have been a big help, because I was introduced to them, but they weren't introduced to me. So it was try and figure it out. And then this one, thoughts and hints. You know, you hear so much talking, you read so many research papers, and as you're reading through them, sometimes you have these little thoughts that don't quite come to fruition. And so my advice is always write them down, because in the midst of all those words, you want to try and nurture those original thoughts, because that's what you're there for, right? And that's, I hope other people feel the same way, because I'd hate to be the only one who discovered this late. Then I know I'm getting towards the end now that I got to the Post-its. I was involved in a research team, and they asked us to read 7 sample interviews and write all our important insights on Post-its, and I ended up with a pile 2 inches thick. That was way too many, and I've still got them at home so I can use them for slides. And so we had a 2-day data analysis marathon. The researchers called it a data party. And the whole team was in the room, and we were all analyzing these ideas we had. And I almost hate to tell you whose research it was, but I was so impressed that our insights were different than the researcher thought they were going to be. And she was really upset because she'd pretty much written the conclusion. So I was involved at the start of the project with the analysis, as I pointed out, and in reading the drafts. And I felt very involved and interested in the project. And in addition, I was compensated for my time, which it took a lot of. And I felt that my effort was appreciated. But this comment made by the primary investigator shows the other side of the equation, where she says, while patient partners were consulted on the original design, we struggled to find meaningful engagement opportunities throughout the research process. And that finding patients who wanted to and were able to be involved throughout, and then maintaining the relationships over long research cycles, was a challenge. And so there I am, feeling engaged and happy, and there she is with so many doubts, she's putting them right into the paper. So, so maybe we're failing to communicate in some areas. And then I put something up about the tips, but I haven't even seen a warning light, and I'm almost to the end. But some points I wanted to stress are these, that there's no cohesive way for patients to come forward and get involved in patient-oriented research. And I'm wondering, where are the low-stress activities to help patients develop their voice and their capacity? In my case, I talked to students over the past 10 years. I've talked to students, and that really helped me feel a lot more comfortable in what many people would call a nightmare situation of public speaking. And so seeing more and more patients play partnership roles in research makes reading research papers a different experience now. And I'm seeing less research that seems as pointless. I saw some terrible ones when I started reading, and I really hate catastrophizing papers. And I would say the Patient Advisors Network has benefited from the rising number of engaged patients and caregivers. And for me, all this involvement in things that I never imagined being part of has been terrific, even despite the nightmares of speaking in public. So thanks very much for your attention.